Gators Breakdown episode 114 is ready to go. The Gators are going to travel to Columbia, South Carolina, and try to avoid a 4-game losing streak as they go up there and take on the South Carolina Gamecocks. I'm your host, David Waters, here on Gators Breakdown. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And joining me tonight is Will Miles from SEC Country. You can find Will on Twitter at WillMilesSEC. Will, what's going on, man?
Nothing much, man. Just hoping we're coming full circle, coming to play Muschamp in a season where we're trying to avoid going 3-8.
Absolutely. And joining us on this episode of Gators Breakdown is another Will. And to give the South Carolina side of things, it's Will Gunter, co-host of the early game on 107.5, the game up in Columbia, South Carolina. Will Gunter, thanks for joining us here on Gators Breakdown.
Glad to do it. Watching a little Maction tonight and found some leftover Halloween candy, so it's been a good night. Or I can't complain with a Wednesday night.
That's right. I'm still eating on my daughter's Halloween candy as well. So,
but they're good for us. Hey, at this point, it's 8 days old, man. You got to make sure that stuff doesn't spoil.
Absolutely. Before we dive in here, remember you can find all your Gators Breakdown episodes on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. Just search on those sites to get the links by following Gators Breakdown on Twitter and on Facebook at Gators Breakdown. And hey, remember, when you're on iTunes, please rate and review the show. Let Gator Nation know what they're getting with Gators Breakdown. So, first off, hopefully this doesn't get too confusing with all the Wills that will be involved in this show. We have Will Gunter, our co-host, Will Miles, or Will Gunter, our guest, our co-host Will Miles, and of course Will Muschamp. So this is the Will Show. If we might as well just call it that. So you will hear the name Will a lot of times, but we would just try and call Muschamp and keep the confusion down a little bit.
Just Coach Boom. We love Coach Boom up here.
There you go. There we go. And we would definitely get into that. It's definitely a reversal for fortunes for him so far. But Will, from afar, what has this season for Florida look like as a fan and a media member of another SEC school? Were you surprised at how this all went down with Jim McElwain?
Well, obviously, I think a lot of us were surprised in terms of how he was let go and the way that the situation escalated so quickly for the Gators and for McElwain. And, you go back to SEC media days in Birmingham and the odds that Jim McElwain would be the first coach fired in the SEC. Boy, you would have probably made a lot of money off of that one. I think we would have assumed it would have been Kevin Sumlin or Butch Jones, and the fact that Florida has somehow beaten Tennessee again in the race to fire a coach. Florida doesn't lose to Tennessee much, and they've once gone out and been able to top the Volunteers. But it's been surprising. I think from the standpoint of the Gators season, to me personally, it's not surprising. You could kind of see this coming, I think, from the outside in. You could see the players leaving, the defensive players leaving Gainesville. You could see that they were not being replaced properly. Jeff Collins is a good defensive coordinator. He goes off to Temple. You could kind of see that Jim McElwain, for whatever reason, was having a struggle finding a quarterback. You thought maybe it'd be Felipe Franks, but the effort that was put into getting Malik Zaire into Gainesville in the offseason, I thought was concerning regarding the development of Felipe Franks. And then you go to Arlington and Malik Zaire's, I think he threw 16 passes in that game, if I remember correctly, but it still wasn't really the quarterback option that I think Florida wanted. And so you could kind of, in my opinion, you could see this coming down the line. Obviously, I didn't see Jim McElwain being fired. I thought he'd be given next year and maybe even get a third year. I mean, you don't fire a guy who's won 2 SEC Eastern Division titles, even though it's not what the Florida fans wanted. But he certainly cracked under the pressure of the job. And I think that's kind of a storyline as Florida goes into its coaching search, the pressure that job puts on head coaches. You got Steve Spurrier, who basically left town because he said winning 10 games wasn't enough. I don't know what happened with Urban Meyer. I've heard a ton of stories, but at the end of the day, Urban Meyer cracked under the pressure. And Jim McElwain cracked under the pressure. That's precisely what happened. He didn't want to be there anymore. That thing was too much of a hot seat for him. And I don't think he did it on purpose, but he certainly found an interesting way to get out of town.
Absolutely. And before we get to the South Carolina side of things, is there a coach out there that you can see that Florida could get and would feel confident that's a good pick for Florida? Looking at it from another opponent side of view.
Well, I think there's a bunch. I mean, I think the thing for Florida and Scott Strickland is finding a coach that appeases the fan base. You can't go. Brent Venables would be a good coach. He would not be a good fit at Florida. You cannot put a defensive coach down there. You've got to get somebody who runs an innovative, high-flying offense. Florida fans don't want to win. They want to win with a lot of points. They don't want a defensive-minded coach. I don't think Florida fans care if they win 55-45. They want an offense that looks good, an offense that's entertaining, an offense that brings them to the Swamp on Saturday. So obviously, Scott Frost and the way his offense has been run, Willie Taggart's an interesting name that we'll see. Dan Mullen, I'll say this: I don't know what Dan Mullen will do, but I think Dan Mullen is the perfect example of why Dan Mullen could take the Florida job if he was offered. You would think, okay, that makes sense. He runs an innovative offense. He's the best quarterbacks coach in the SEC, maybe the country. And you look at what he's done, but does Dan Mullen want to leave a situation where he's got so much job security? They're on 9 straight years. They've won 6 games now, 9 straight years of bowl eligibility at Mississippi State. That guy could run for mayor of Starkville and would win it because of what he's done in Starkville. I know they get upset with him from time to time, but he's got a cushy contract, makes a lot of money, and he is not being fired anytime soon. Whereas if he goes to Gainesville and he doesn't win an Eastern Division championship within 3 years, he's on an extremely hot seat, maybe looking for another job. So I think that's going to be interesting to see how the Florida job is perceived nowadays. I know all coaches think, hey, I can go there and win. But, man, you go to Florida and you're not successful, you don't get a honeymoon. You're expected to be successful in 2018, 2019, and then in 2020 playing for a national championship.
Yeah, so certainly the South Carolina coach, Will Muschamp, has some experience with that, with the fan base at Florida. But he's come into South Carolina, had him bowl eligible last year at 6-7, now sitting at 6-3. What do you really think Muschamp has learned in his time at Florida that he's applied at South Carolina to be as successful as they have been the last couple of years?
Well, I think they've caught some breaks. I mean, I think they've caught some breaks. Obviously, last year, playing Tennessee when they did and making the adjustment to Jake Bentley. I think that was big. Who knows where Will Muschamp's at if he plays, Will Greer weighed 150 pounds before he founded the GNC store. Who knows if I think that was a big thing last year, going to Jake Bentley, and showed a big part of what he learned from Florida. Who knows where they're at if they go to Will Greer instead of Treon Harris when Jeff Driscoll comes unglued. So I think that's been a part of it. It's going to be interesting this offseason what he does, what he elects to do with Kurt Roper, because this is an offense that they're going to get Deebo Samuel back in 2018, and I think that'll tell us more about what Will Muschamp's learned. But I think knowing how to handle certain situations on and off the field and how to coach guys, like he said, he's now in his 6th year of being a head coach. He's a better head coach today than he was in year 1 in Gainesville because he's been through some of this. He knows how to handle situations, knows how to handle players. And he's able to implement his system in Columbia at a little bit slower rate than he was in Gainesville.
All right, Will, going through the first 9 games, nationally, South Carolina is 115th, I think, in the country in total offense, about 335 yards per game, 24.4 points per game. Many believe this offense would be better than those numbers. But like at Florida, he's had some bad injury luck. You mentioned Deebo Samuel was injured, and after having a really, really great start to the season, should this offense be further along in your opinion, or are you pretty much expecting a jump in production after seeing what Florida's done the last couple of weeks on defense?
No, they are what they are. South Carolina is what they are on offense. That's a unit that's going to go out. You cannot be – look, Kurt Roper – needs to have some good games going forward here. And I think Will Muschamp, given that he's going to have Jake Bentley in year 3, given that Rico Dowdle will be back, what A.J. Turner's done, given that he's got some very good – Brian McClendon has brought in some really good wide receivers. The offense in 2018 should be among the best in the country. I know that's insane to say when they're sitting at about 120 now, but the playmakers will be there, and Eric Wolford's done a good job with the offensive line. But a big part of South Carolina's struggles offensively are Jake Bentley. Jake Bentley has not played – statistically, he's having a great year. 14 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. I think he's around 1,800 yards. He's thrown for he's completed 60% of his passes. But he's missed some open guys in situations to hit big touchdowns. Against Georgia, they ran a wheel route early on in the game. A.J. Turner came out of the backfield. if he throws a good football, if he throws a good ball, it's a touchdown. Instead, he overthrows it. I know it's one throw, but there's been multiple instances of that throughout the year where South Carolina's had the opportunity for a big play down the field. Jake Bentley's just simply missed it. And so I don't think you can be an absolutist and say, well, it's Kurt Roper's fault. I don't think you can say it's all Jake Bentley's fault. The offensive line has had some injuries. Zach Bailey's the best offensive lineman. He was out for a couple games. But I don't expect them on Saturday to show up and be some kind of offensive juggernaut. Look, they're not going to put up 40. If they put up 45, Randy Shannon shouldn't be allowed back on the plane, or Chris Rump shouldn't be allowed back on the plane. But the bottom line is they're not going to go out and do that. There's no way I see South Carolina going out putting up more than 4 touchdowns on Florida this coming Saturday, unless Florida just plays with 7 guys on defense the entire game.
Yeah, so Tyson Williams, Rico Dowdle, and A.J. Turner, the 3 running backs, they have 29 catches thus far, and Hayden Hurst, the tight end, has 30. Certainly Florida's had some issues with their linebackers in coverage on both tight ends and on running backs. You think Bentley's licking his chops at this point, being able to exploit Florida's linebackers? I mean, seems like that's something South Carolina's done pretty consistently thus far this season.
The key word up here has been RPO, run pass option. It's like
what is that? We don't know what that is.
Run pass option. Good Lord. I can't go through a football season without the run pass option buzzword. People make it a drinking game and don't make it through the first quarter up here. The run pass option, they run kind of a zone read, and Bentley's got to decide whether to hand it off or throw a pass. And good grief, the excitement of that. It's predicated on what the linebacker does. Maybe they can hit some home runs on it Saturday. Hayden Hurst was a big part of the Georgia game plan. There's been times this year where they've kept him in as a blocker, and we'll see. I thought it was fascinating to me. You think about Florida, and obviously you always think about offense, but again, that defense is almost last in the conference in sacks per game. That was a pretty surprising stat. I don't know if they'll have to keep Hayden Hurst in as a blocker on Saturday. They can release him against a Beauchamp. Was it Beauchamp Joseph? I forget his name. I know I covered him in recruiting.
Yeah, that's it. Yep.
You can release him against some of those guys. He can get out and go. And Hayden Hurst was a big part last week. You kind of expect him to be a big part of the offense this week, along with Brian Edwards or Trey Smith.
Will Gunter joining us here on Gators Breakdown, talking South Carolina. It'll take some time to get the defense up to par where Will Muschamp expects it to be, but it has improved. And I think the most noticeable improvement as the season goes on, and kind of going back to last year, statistically, has come against the run. And I think South Carolina's getting up about 149 yards per game on the ground this year after allowing 203 last year. And this defensive line's really come on. Is that the team? Is that the unit that's really helped this defense come along?
It is. They've brought in, a year in Jeff Dillman's system. I think Jeff Dillman is wildly underrated for what he's been able to do at South Carolina with some of these players. Adding a guy like Javon Kinlaw, who's watched his snaps increase each and every week, has helped. And then listen, you get a Sky Moore back, and at linebacker you get T.J. Brunson, who's was the very first recruit that Will Muschamp went and saw when he got to South Carolina. He did his press conference and then drove across town, and T.J. Brunson was set to go to Louisville, and Will Muschamp was able to flip him. Brunson's in his second year and has been very good. So you've had better linebacker play, and the defensive line is playing better. They're stronger. They're a year into the system. They are good linemen. Dante Sawyer was one of the top defensive linemen in the Southeast coming out of Georgia, out of the state of Georgia. He just couldn't make the grade. He was going to junior college regardless of what happened, and that's exactly what he did. Kier Thomas was committed to Florida State, was going to go to Auburn, so he's a pretty solid player. You look at Taylor Stallworth, who's been a 5-year player, a 4-year player, redshirting a year, and is a solid player for the Gamecocks. Yorick Jones. That they've gotten production up front, and they continue to get it. And we know Will Muschamp can scheme a defense and Travaris Robinson. So they've been able to take advantage and really coach those guys up maybe above the level that they should be at.
You mentioned Sky Moore. He's got 67 total tackles, 7 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, and also 2 INTs. So, it seems like he's been all over the field. What do you think Florida has to do to neutralize him? Because it seems like he's sort of the linchpin of what Muschamp's trying to do.
Yeah, you got to know where he's at. They'll line him up occasionally on third downs. We've seen him drop back almost into a safety position. Now, South Carolina will move 10 guys up closer to the box and drop Sky Moore back because of his ability to read and react. So if he drops back into that safety position, you got to keep an eye on him. He's phenomenal, really. I think he's one interception away. They took one away from him a couple weeks ago, and it's thrown my numbers off. It was a pass interference. I can't remember if he's either tied the career interception mark in South Carolina or if he's now in the lead. But he's right there at it. Like I said, he had an interception against Vanderbilt. They got called back, and it's really skewed my numbers on that. But he's all over the field. And then he just has great instincts. And again, it helps for him that he's got some defensive linemen that can eat up blocks up front. And I know Florida losing Brett Hagee this week is a big loss for them. And so you're talking about an offensive line that maybe South Carolina doesn't get the penetration into the backfield that they necessarily might need to cause a lost yardage play. But what it does is it opens the gaps for Brunson and a guy like Sky Moore to shoot in there and have a clean look at a running back and or a quarterback.
Well, Gunter, I can't thank you enough for joining us here on Gators Breakdown and breaking down the South Carolina Gamecocks team as Florida goes in there and tries to end the losing streak. Everybody can listen to you at 107.5 The Game up there in Columbia, right?
Yeah, join us. We'll do, actually, if you're coming into town, myself and the guy who does the afternoon show, we'll do a pregame show from 7:30 to 8:45 on Saturday morning. So we'll get up early. It's supposed to be nice and cold up here, so hopefully you boys like good cold weather. And it'll be an interesting game. Certainly an I tell you, a lot of Gamecock fans very nervous about this game. Malik Zaire, a mobile quarterback. It'll be interesting to see how what kind of scheme Doug Nussmeier can come up with and how he attempts to attack Muschamp and Travaris Robinson on Saturday with a more mobile quarterback.
Yeah, it won't be a good one, believe me.
There's a lot of Gamecock fans there's a lot of scared Gamecock fans. Last time they were a touchdown favorite up here, Kentucky rolled out of here with a 10-point victory. It's a very odd atmosphere so far this week on the radio as we do our show each and every morning, and a lot of people very hesitant. This has been a better series. The last Florida was so dominant up until Spurrier took over here, and it's been a very even series. Florida leads the series 7-5 over the last 12 years. So it's been a more competitive series, and certainly some odd ties between the two programs, with South Carolina taking the last two, taking Spurrier, getting Spurrier, and then getting Muschamp. So weird series. Always a lot of fun. Should be an entertaining game on Saturday, though.
Absolutely. Will Gunter joining us here on Gators Breakdown. Will, thank you very much.
Appreciate it, guys. Y'all take care.
You too, man. All right. Will Miles. So now I can just say Will and be confident that everybody knows who I'm talking about. Yeah, so, Will brought up, they are kind of worried about the mobile quarterback, but we know, and we've had another game to show us that Doug Nussmeier won't call many design runs for the quarterback, and more importantly, Malik Zaire last week. So I'm not so sure. They really have to worry about that.
No, they shouldn't be worried about it. In the preview article that's coming out tomorrow that I wrote about, or I wrote about this specifically, writing about the fact that they only gave Zaire one read option play in the first half, and it went for 5 yards. They got a face mask on it, so they netted 20 yards. And for a team that couldn't move the ball at all, that one play got them 20 yards. It also freed up Mark Thompson and LaMichael Pirine a little bit after they had run it on that particular drive. They turned that one into the field goal, which I'm not sure anybody really appreciated Shannon kicking the field goal in that instance. But, it was points, and the team struggled to put points up on the board, and Zaire's his read option was part of that. It opens up the offense. You can see the defensive ends and the linebackers collapsing when you go look at the tape, and they just refuse to run it. And I don't know why. I have an idea. I mean, we were hoping last week, and I think it was more hope than it was than it was maybe based on any sort of empirical evidence. But we were hoping that sort of offense had been limited by McElwain, but that just hasn't been the case. And when you look back, so I went back and I looked at the quarterback the year before Nussmeier arrived and the year after. And if you look at Jake Locker at Washington, he ran for 986 yards without Nussmeier, 388 without. You look at Devin Gardner, it's 483 without, 258 with. And if you look at Treon Harris, it's 332 without and 244 with. So these mobile quarterbacks that Nussmeier
Go back to that Jake Locker number again.
Yeah, 986 yards rushing in 2007. He was hurt in 2008, so he had significantly less carries.
Yeah.
But in 2009, with the same approximately number of games played, he had 388 yards. So he rushed for a third of the amount of yards under Nussmeier that he did under his previous offensive coordinator. And so, it's not a surprise that the Florida quarterbacks are not running the ball. That's not what Nussmeier does. It's not what he's done historically. And it is just, it's egregious based on what you see from the defense. They're collapsing, and they are targeting the running back in a way that they know that if it's, and as long as it's not 3rd and 10 and they're running play action, they know that they're handing it off and they're just firing at them. And we saw that last year in the Tennessee game where they couldn't get the run going in the second half. And if Appleby had pulled the ball a couple of times, he probably would have been able to get some critical first downs, and they win that game. Saw it this year in the Tennessee game. If you go back and look at the tape, even though Florida was able to pull that one out, there were a lot of instances where had the quarterback had the freedom or the ability to pull the ball out from the running back and run around end, he would have been able to make some yards. And in the Texas A&M game, we did see a couple of plays where they looked like they were designed run plays. They might have been a run pass option actually, but if the slant wasn't open, he was allowed to take off. There were a couple of things like that, and even Frank showed that he was able to do that. So, Zaire obviously I think is the more mobile quarterback of the two, but both of them are relatively mobile, and it's not as if they're lighting the world on fire with their throwing ability. So you got to throw something else in there, and he just hasn't been willing to do it.
Yeah, and the South Carolina defense, they did a pretty good job last week against Georgia. Held Nick Chubb and Sonny Michel to 193 combined rushing yards. Now, don't get me wrong, that is a lot. But, in just one touchdown. That was on 36 carries, so that duo only averaged about 5 yards a carry. And look, it was 193 combined yards when those guys are getting about 280 yards a game. So, they did their job on keying on that Georgia run game. And, hey, look, this Florida run game is okay. They've lost Malik Davis, but LaMichael Pirine ran hard at times against Missouri. Looked like one of the only offensive guys that, that really cared a whole lot last week. But I'm still not sure if Florida can take advantage of just because of the limitations that you just discussed of Doug Nussmeier and not opening up this run game with his legs. So, the thing is, we can sit here and every week until this season ends, and thankfully only got 3 more games of this of Doug Nussmeier being the offensive coordinator. But as you said, it's every time we're going to preview a game, it's going to be hope that we see the quarterback's legs being used, whether it's Zaire in there or they come back and if he struggles again and Franks is in the game and using his legs too. So, and I know a lot of people we're kind of going back and looking at Felipe Franks and why weren't they using his legs a little bit more? And there was the excuse of, well, they don't want him getting injured. There's no faith in Zaire. Well, I think Zaire showed enough last week where he opened up the middle of the field a little bit. Now, don't get me wrong. They still were only scoring 9 points. There were 3 field goals at that time, so they still weren't putting points on the board. But there were some things in this offense he did well that Felipe Franks can't do, and vice versa the other way around. So, but still, we were looking at the excuse of not wanting to get Felipe Franks hurt. Then that wasn't an excuse, and that should have been used. But going back to McElwain, maybe what we've heard now, where he didn't want to go away from Franks, he wanted to play Franks. He didn't want to play Zaire. Maybe that led to not running Franks as much. But right now you don't have that limitation. You don't have that handcuff. But it looks like the handcuff itself is Doug Nussmeier and nothing to do with the head coach.
Well, I mean, I think some of the stuff with McElwain is probably a little bit of sour grapes from the people who have had to interact with him. Now, I don't know the man. I have no idea. It sounds like, he and the university clearly had a division and that was something that started to fester. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what he was trying to do was a terrible thing. And he and Nussmeier are really good friends. I would imagine that they were able to work through their differences and decide what to do. The reality is when you look at Zaire at Notre Dame, he had 4 games where he threw more than 15 passes. And in those games, he averaged 12 rushing attempts for 54 yards. At Florida, he has 2 games where he's got more than 15 pass attempts. He's totaled 14 rushing attempts for -6 yards, and 6 of those rushing attempts are sacks. So he's had 8 rushing attempts in the 2 games where he's played significant time. So they just are not running him at the same rate as he's been run in the past. I mean, other people who identified this as a skill skill and something that could keep the defense off balance, and saw success with it. I mean, Zaire was able to, he was able to move the offense at Notre Dame. And so, I just don't get it. I don't know why they won't do it. Injuries, I think, are a poor excuse, especially at this point, because, injuries would be fine if your quarterback was playing well enough to keep you in the games. When you're down by 40 points, it's like, okay, how much worse could the walk-on be? I just don't know. At some point, you have to say, I'm going to change, or, you're not, and you're going to go down with what you believe in. And, that was sort of, I think, some of the things that people were frustrated with McElwain. And obviously, if Nussmeier's is as good a friend as we think he is, then maybe that's the same thing with him as well. And, we're just going to have to live with it. The reality is, though, when Muschamp knows what's coming, for all the criticisms that Florida fans can give of Muschamp, and I think there's some legitimate ones, when Muschamp knows what's coming from the opposing offense, they struggle, because he is able to design defenses to take away what you want to do. And in this case, he's going to look at the tape and he's just going to say, I'm going to make them run the ball with the quarterback. I'm going to ignore him until they actually prove they're going to do it. And I'm just not sure they're going to prove they're going to do it.
So here's another thing. Will Muschamp, look, we got to have fun with this, because that's kind of where we're at with this Gator team right now. But will Muschamp expect a 3rd and 20 play action?
Oh my God! I mean, there's just nothing more infuriating than seeing that. I mean, and the problem is with the injuries on the offensive line now. Even before, it's not as if they were Alabama in pass protection, but you can't waste that kind of time when you're dropping back. I mean, you have to be looking at the defense. It's to get to your second, to your third read, to be able to find the hole in the zone, to know to slide in the pocket when you need to get away from pressure, because you don't have your head down looking at the play action. There's no value to doing it.
None.
The value, if you're going to fake something at that point, fake a screen. Because a lot of people run screens on 3rd and 20. A few people run draws. Nobody runs just like a stretch play on 3rd and 20. So no one's biting. And even if you did run a stretch play, they don't care. So
and even that still takes too long to develop. So.
Well, I mean, we can complain all we want about the Florida offense all day long, and deservedly so. But
just trying to have some fun with it.
I think there were a lot of people who piled on the Florida players for their effort last week, and I think some of that based on some of the comments by David Reese is probably justified in terms of what's going on in that locker room. But I got to be honest. I mean, when the coach's game plan is that much garbage, why would you go out and play? I mean, literally, you have a dual threat quarterback that they refuse to make dual threat. Legit. And so it shouldn't, the fact that the locker room is saying, why should we go out and give 110% when this is the game plan they're going to give us, I don't think should be a surprise. And I'm not sure we should criticize the players as much as we should go back to criticizing the coaches. I mean, there was a little bit of relief on the coaches, I think, because McElwain was jettisoned. And maybe some of that ire was focused towards the players. But, I mean, that was just an awful game plan. Yeah. And I don't know how you can, I mean, they weren't going to win with that game plan, even if the players gave maximum effort. And so I'm not going to pile on the players. I think it's on the coaches yet again.
Boom. I like that. That was a good point there. Well, so how do we see this one playing out a little bit? I think it's kind of similar to last week, but I don't see South Carolina being able to put that many points up on the board. So I still think it's another week where Florida struggles. Until we see this offense prove it, I don't see much coming along. So we won't spend too much time into it, because it's going to be negative. We want to get to some coach talk before we sign off on this episode. But I see something like a 24-10 type of win for South Carolina here.
Yeah, I have it 27-13. Pretty much same thing. Yeah. I think the Will's observations about the South Carolina offense are legitimate. Jake Bentley really has not progressed from year 1 to year 2. He's thrown more touchdowns this year, but he's got more attempts. His touchdown to interception ratio is about the same. He's not terrible. I mean, he is in the upper echelon of quarterbacks in the SEC, but that's not really saying a whole lot right now. And he's certainly better than what Florida's running out there right now. But I think they're still going to struggle, and especially with Samuel gone, they're going to struggle. But I think at the end of the day, so will Florida. The offensive line injuries are going to take its toll. The defensive injuries are also starting to take their toll. There was a lot of discussion about recruiting and the depth and things like that after the Missouri game. But let's be honest, the talent level on Florida's side was higher than Missouri's the Missouri's talent level, and with a good game plan and a good effort, Florida should win that game. I don't know if that's the same thing that you can say this week. I think South Carolina, particularly with some of the classes that Muschamp's brought in, and with some of the injuries and suspensions on Florida's side, they're probably about equivalent in talent. And then I don't have faith in the game plan from Florida to be able to pull it out.
Same here. So hopefully, it won't be as ugly. We don't have to endure another 3 hours of what we saw last week. But it was not fun hearing the announcers, call out our team and all that. But it comes with the territory when you put a performance out there like that. So.
Yeah, well, the good news is it can only go up, right? And so we'll
or the same, or the same.
Well, you bring in a new guy. You bring in a new guy who holds the people accountable, who starts bringing in recruiting classes that are highly ranked, so that you get competition. So you can't make stupid mistakes because there's somebody waiting to take your job, and all of a sudden that starts bringing people into line. I mean, one of the hidden parts of the suspensions is that there really can't be any competition because there just aren't enough bodies. Yeah. And that's you say, well, the talent that was lost maybe isn't top tier, and I mean, Scarlett and Callaway certainly were, but I think you start to feel that in both the depth, but then you start to feel it in the competition as well.
Absolutely. So we can't sign off without talking some coaching. Coaching search out there, of course, is just the hot button topic on these Gators and social media everywhere, message boards. It is coach talk. So, Will, you had an article released earlier this week, I believe it was Sunday, that really caught the attention of Gator Nation out there. You brought up David Shaw would be a really good candidate for the job, and there was a lot of back and forth with that one, and I think he's a West Coast guy at the job he really wants to be at, but I do like the reason and some of the reasons you outlined of why he would be a good fit at Florida.
Yeah, I mean, the article started because everyone had really gotten interested in Frost and Norvell and Taggart, these guys who have relatively limited track records. And to be quite honest, are Florida searching for someone who's cheaper than an elite level coach? And Florida's revenue has gone up from something like 85 million in 2006 to 140 million in 2017. And so the program hasn't really increased the amount of money that they're spending on their coaches. And you look at where Florida's coaches rank in terms of the top 10 or the top 15 in the country, and McElwain, with his raise this year before the season started, got into that top 15, but he's not in the top 5. And quite honestly, since recruiting is such a huge part of the deal, you got to have that top tier guy if you want to be winning top tier games. So, I went into it saying, who is the top tier guy out there? I think Bob Stoops fits that description, but whether he wants to coach or not is an open decision or is an open question. I think Chip Kelly fits that description as well a little bit. But the guy I focused on was David Shaw, and the reason is if you look at Stanford, he recruited significantly better at Stanford than Harbaugh has, and so Harbaugh was there and he turned the program around, and obviously he got it sort of moving in the right direction. But Shaw was his offensive coordinator there, and after Shaw took over, recruiting had a significant uptick. The guy's won the Pac-12 3 times in 6 years. He's won over, I think, 77% of his games out there. He has just done a fantastic job at a school where it's really hard to win, and a school where, quite honestly, he's going to have a hard time competing for national championships. And his name used to get brought up in terms of NFL jobs, and there's been some rumblings that he's been disappointed that his name hasn't been coming up in those NFL jobs, and Florida would raise his profile. Now, he makes almost $6 million, which means you're going to have to pony up to get him over to Gainesville. And again, is Shaw the right guy for this program? I mean, certainly, obviously no Florida ties. He's a West Coast guy. Stanford is where he played. His dad coached there. So there are a lot of connections there, and maybe he doesn't want to come. But the point is that, Scott Frost is an up-and-coming coach, but I don't – and if he's the guy you think can lead your program to prominence, that's great. But if you got some doubts about whether he can lead your program to prominence, there are other guys out there that if you're willing to open up your checkbook, you'll be able to bring them in. And I'm not quite sure why people aren't bringing up some of those people. So even people like Chris Peterson out at Washington, he's making about $4 million. Could you give him $8 million and would he make a jump? Or even somebody like Stoops, just make him a Godfather offer and try to get him out of retirement. But the reality is, if you want a top 5 program, you need top 5 recruiting classes, and coaches are the guys who bring in the recruits, and the head coach are the guys who bring in the recruits. And so those are the people. it's a business at this point. You make money by investing in the coaches. Alabama has certainly done that, and Florida is going to need to do it too if they want to bring the program back to winning national championships.
Yeah, that's one thing I would definitely agree on. If you want to, you got to spend the money now. And there's been some rumblings that the old way of doing it, that Florida did it, they didn't want to spend the money. They wanted to get the bargain coach. And I think a lot of that comes from Steve Spurrier back in the 90s. He would say, "Oh, I don't need that stuff. I'll go out there and win anyway." And I think the higher ups at Florida kind of got used to that. And it's going to take some time or actually some realization to look, that's not how it's done anymore. This is a different world. It's a different recruiting world now. You got to go out there. You got to spend the money to get the guys. So, we know the names that have been thrown out there for the Florida job: Scott Frost, Mike Norvell, Taggart, Mullen, Charlie Strong, Bob Stoops, Chip Kelly. Those are some names that are kind of come with the standard of talking about this Florida job now. But, what if Florida goes somewhere we don't expect, or for whatever reason they have to go further down the list than expected? And now I'm not saying this happens. I want to get that clear. I don't think that happens. I think the hire comes from those guys I really just mentioned. But there are some outliers. And let me preface this by saying I don't think these guys will be or should be the next head coach at Florida. But this is a podcast and we can deal with hypotheticals. So, we've laid out reasons in the past about these other guys, but just in case. I've come up with some other names that can be discussed, I think, with this Florida job. Lane Kiffin, of course, his name's kind of ramped up on social media a little bit lately. And you and I, we had a little bit of private conversation about him earlier today. So we'll get there. But, DJ Durkin, Butch Davis, Mike Gundy, Dino Babers, Kevin Sumlin, if he gets fired from A&M, those are, I think, outlier names. If for whatever reason Florida can't get that main group of guys we threw out there and have talked about past. Those are some names I think that could be looked out for.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, if all you're trying to do is mimic Alabama, then you're gonna have limited success. Yeah. And I think that's what Florida's tried to do by hiring Muschamp and hiring McElwain is let's mimic Alabama, and you're just gonna have problems doing that. So you need to figure out how to differentiate yourself within your own brand. And Florida's brand is obviously explosive offense, and certainly with the athletes in the state, that's really. That's an effective brand to have. Obviously, Saban's brand is bone-crunching defense and a strong offensive line. You don't have to have those same components to compete with him if you find a different way to do it. And Urban Meyer proved that when he came to the SEC and went to a spread when everybody said that wouldn't work. So, and even in that capacity, then I say you can. So again, your brand is high-flying offense, which is why I think bringing in a defensive guy probably doesn't work. It's why some people have the desire somebody like Lane Kiffin because they miss those days where Spurrier was making fun of Tennessee and you can't spell citrus without UT and Peyton Manning being the 4-time Citrus Bowl MVP and those sorts of things. I mean, they miss that kind of thing. They miss the swagger, particularly after this year where all the press conferences from McElwain were so subdued and then sort of all the and yets and, that's really cool and that's really neat and those sorts of things. And just bringing in somebody who, Kiffin, after McElwain was let go, started following everybody at Florida on Twitter. So, I can understand why people expect or why people look at that and gravitate towards that because, that sort of brashness, I think, is Florida's brand and the buttoned up Saban-esque type of I guess, mask they've been trying to put on the last 6 or 7 years. Not only has it not worked, but it's just not who Florida is. It's not Florida's brand.
Yeah, and I agree. And a little bit of breaking news, so we'll figure out, probably won't be breaking news by the time some people listen to this podcast, but wide receiver Jamar Chase has decommitted from Florida, so.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think it's not a surprise that some of these guys are going to leave. A lot of it depends on who the next coach is, and he'll probably get some calls from the next guy who comes in. But it's not a surprise that somebody would start looking around with all the stuff that's been going on at Florida.
Yep, quote here, after talking at length with God and my family, processing my thoughts and prayers, I come to a fork in the road where I have to make one of the hardest decisions of my recruiting process. UF has been really good to me. I would like to thank Coach Skip, Coach Mack, and the rest of the UF staff for all the love and support that they've shown me. But at this time, I have to do what's best for my family and me. At this time, I am decommitting from the University of Florida and opening back up my recruiting process. I want to thank all the fans for their love and support. This is the most important decision of my life, and I need to look at everything wholeheartedly. I realize that I can make everyone happy I can't make everyone happy. This will affect a lot of people. However, I have to do what's best for my family and me. So, talking about coaching, this will be, something that they're going to have to deal with. There's going to be some decommits more than likely. Kind of previewed it in one of my previous podcasts that this is going to happen. There's going to be some decommits. There's going to be some transfers. And part of the reason we're talking here about these coaches, Will, is it's going to be, a coach that can come in here and have some recruiting prowess, some I think experience either recruiting in the state of Florida or having a system to recruit to that recruits are familiar with, know what to do, or just plain and simple would just be a really, really, really good recruiter. You don't have to have ties to Florida. You don't the system, or you can just be a really good recruiter. So there are plenty of guys out there who fit that mold, and we'll just kind of see where Florida goes. But they'll be walking into a little bit of a hornet's nest with some decommitments. I think this probably won't be the first one out of this.
Well, that's the other reason I think Florida should probably consider a big name and really opening up their wallet is that, you bring in a guy like Norvell. He's obviously a pretty good recruiter, but does he have the chops to save a class in this capacity? I don't necessarily know that, which means he's going to have to show progress on the field before people start committing, which was sort of the problem with McElwain, right? Yeah. Is that had this year been a year where there was progress made on the offensive side, then the classes coming in the next 2 years were going to really supplement, at least on the offensive side of the ball, really getting the ball moving. But the fact that there just wasn't any progress shown, this class wasn't going to stay together. I think Bill said this last week. I mean, this class was going to see some attrition, and you were already seeing some of the guys like Copeland and Chase and those sorts of guys taking some visits elsewhere just because of the things that were going on before any of the job security issues popped up. So, I think this is a reason why maybe you go after a big name. Even if you swing and miss, it's worth going after him because that big name can help galvanize the class, bring a few extra guys in. And if you're bringing in a top 3, top 4 class next year, and you bring in a new system that shows significant improvement, well, all of a sudden recruiting is going to be really bumping by the time 2018 comes around.
Yep, and Chase was a top 100 commit, and we talked about the lack of talent and lack of top tier talent. Florida hasn't been able to bring in under Jim McElwain, and now one of the ones that was there is no longer part of the 2018 class. So probably look out for TCU there, some schools out west back in the look out there. He's from Louisiana, so might get back in. LSU might get back in the mix, but I think TCU is probably the team to watch out there for Chase. So we're talking about outliers and where Florida could go. I mean, I feel pretty confident in saying the big names that we've talked about with, Frost, Norvell, Taggart, Mullen, Strong, Stoops, Kelly. I would have to assume the hire comes from one of those names. Wouldn't you think?
I would think so. I mean, a lot of it depends, I think, on how much Florida's willing to spend because the price of these guys is going up. I mean, that's the other thing I think is that anybody who thinks Frost is coming to Florida for $4 million a year, I think is deluding themselves. Yep. I mean, he's got Florida and Nebraska. If they both want him and they're both bidding on him, I mean, it's going to take 6. And, the question is it worth $6 million for a guy who's got a year and a half worth of coaching under his belt as a head coach? Certainly he's got the Oregon pedigree, but, if you have the opportunity to bring in Chip Kelly, he's the guy who trained Frost. Would you be better off just bringing in Chip Kelly for $6 million as opposed to bringing in Frost for $6 million? I think that's a decision Strickland's going to have to make. I know what direction I would go in, but that doesn't mean it's the right one. It's just just the one I'd go in because I prefer the established track record because I think they need to make a splash in recruiting, and I think the established name is going to help that more than an assistant or more than someone with limited head coaching experience.
Yeah, and with Kelly and Stoops, I would think you would have to hear something pretty soon, within a week, no more than a week from now. It's November 8th now, so I would say by November 15th, 16th, the 17th, that next Friday. I would say if it's Stoops or Kelly, one of the guys that don't currently have a job, you would probably start hearing that they're really interested or they're really close to getting the Florida job because, hey, look, if they really want this job, they're hurting themselves by not going ahead and and getting this job with the early signing period. That's going to be December 20th, getting these recruits. We have already seen a decommit now. So, you want to stop that bleeding. The sooner you get in, the sooner you help yourself. So I think if it's Stoops or Kelly, you'll start hearing it pretty soon that it's going to be one of those two guys because they have no job to worry about now. Recruiting is going to be very, very important. You can get to see this team. Maybe you get to see this team up close. Maybe look going into the maybe UAB game and the FSU game if they can get in around the program around that time, because it probably may not be a bowl game for these coaches to watch, a new coach to watch. So I would think if it's one of those two guys, you might start hearing something soon.
No, I mean that would be the advantage, or one of the other advantages with going with those guys, right? Is that they're not necessarily they're not tied to anything, and so you can bring them in and you can get them started right away. And certainly the early signing period, we've talked about this before, how that sort of changes the blueprint for this type of thing. I wonder whether, based on what happens, whether some coaches who decide to take a year off or will decide to take a year off, knowing that they'd be able to jump into these sweepstakes and be in high demand because they don't have a job when someone's let a coach early. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because certainly there's value in being able to bring somebody like Stoops, for example, in late November rather than having to wait until after a AAC championship game or something like that.
Absolutely. Well, anything else, man?
No, you mentioned the Kiffin.
The
Kiffin debate we had. So I think Kiffin. It's funny because I think his ceiling or his floor may be Ron Zook, but I think his ceiling may be Ron Zook because I was looking at his history at USC. His recruiting classes were number 3 in the country, number 3 in the country, number 8 in the country, and they finished unranked twice in the 3 years that he was there. And obviously the 4th year he was there, he got fired when they were 3-2, got left on the tarmac. So I worry because I really do think that there's a correlation between where you finish in the AP poll and your recruiting rankings in terms of how good of a coach you are. And in past stops, he's really struggled. And USC is a premium program. Certainly SC had some scholarship reductions, but they were still bringing in top tier talent. And with all those 5 stars they were bringing in, even with their limited scholarship numbers, you would expect them to be better than only finishing ranked once in the 4 years he was there. Because the 4th year they were 3-2, and then when the replacement took over, he led them up to 19th. But and if you look at Stoops in his 18 years at Oklahoma, the AP final ranking for him was 13.2, and his national recruiting average was 10.5. And in the conference, he averaged 1.6 in the Big 12, and then they finished 1.6 on average for his 18 years.
Okay.
So the track record for Stoops indicates that his coaching acumen is just as good as his recruiting. Same thing applies to David Shaw, actually. In fact, it's even better. He's recruited I think 22nd, and their AP ranking has been considerably better than that. And so, those are the types of guys I think you want to bring in. Those are the premium coaches that you want to bring in. Kiffin's not going to be much cheaper than anybody else, other than maybe he's got a little bit of there's a little bit of toxicity there that maybe keeps some schools away from him. But, I don't think he's going to be much cheaper than those other options, and he just doesn't have the track record.
Yeah, you would have to hope, you go back to his USC days, you would have to hope he learned something from his days at Bama under Saban and see, and he would be the one guy, we're talking about the Saban tree. I don't necessarily put him in that, the Saban tree, of having to get away from, build your program like Saban. I think he's learned from Saban, but I wouldn't necessarily think he would try and build the program or build the type of offense, or just straight smash mouth defense. I think he would be a guy who would open it up from the get-go and keep it that way. There are things I do like about him. He knows how to identify playmakers and get the ball in the playmakers' hands. We've seen that time and time again when Florida matched up against him when he was at Alabama. But I would have my worries about has he learned from his time at USC? He's kind of had that strong, brash personality, so we kind of know that was one of the negatives of Jim McElwain's time at Florida. So would Scott Strickland go that route again of having to have another coach with an ego I'm not sure, if it would be really butting heads with an AD. I'm not sure if that's Kiffin style. We know his social media presence, and you talked about as soon as McElwain was fired, he goes and starts following a bunch of Florida people. That was on purpose. It was trolling at its best, and that's what Lane Kiffin does. I mean, heck, there's a Lane train at FAU right now that's riding around on campus with his big old face plastered on the front of it. I mean,
it's really funny. I mean, it's amusing. It would be fun, which for us is great. I just don't know that Florida would win. You said a key word there. You said you hope he's learned from his experiences. You hope. And my whole point with the David Shaw article was not necessarily to say David Shaw should be the head coach. It should be that Florida can't afford to hope that the coach can do what they need him to do. They can't afford to hope that a limited track record, well, that's because he was rebuilding a program, or that, if we don't get him, somebody else is going to get him, or something like that. There are guys out there who have extended track records of winning, and the only thing it's going to require is that they shell out some money. And so, they were willing to shell out money to get rid of McElwain. I'm not sure why they wouldn't be willing to shell out money to bring in, there's never a sure thing. But Chip Kelly's like 49-4. Bob Stoops has won 150 games. Yeah. Actually, I think it's more like 180. He's like 188-40 or something like that. So, these guys have shown that they have the acumen to win games, to build programs. I don't think you need to hope with them. And my biggest concern about the idea that people are just saying frost or bust is that there's still some hope there. Doesn't mean he's not going to be a great coach, and it doesn't mean I wouldn't support him if he came in as the Florida head coach. If he's the right guy, if he walks in and he's got something magical about him, you just go, this is the next assistant coach, or the next, lower level coach who's going to be a huge success in the Power Five. That's great. But if you're paying him $5 million or $6 million because you hope he's going to be the next guy, and there are these other guys out there, I think you really have to give them a look.
Yeah, and there was a reason Kiffin wasn't in that main group I mentioned, because there would be some things that needed to happen before I would say he needs to be the head coach of Florida. It was Florida, falling down and not getting those main names that I named. And one of those main names, Will, and I do want to sign off here quickly, but Charlie Strong, should he be more considered? Should he be considered more for the Florida job?
No, I think the timing is really bad. I mean, the taste of the Texas job is still in everyone's mouth. If he was at Louisville and they were winning still, I think he's the guy you say, look at that track record, look at his recruiting, look at his Florida ties, all that sort of stuff. But the fact that he didn't have success at Texas, wasn't able to build that program, that he's a defensive guy, and then that the offense at Texas really struggled while he was there. I think all those things work against him. So if McElwain had lasted another year or two, then and USF had played really, really well, then I think Charlie Strong, is a really strong candidate for the job. Maybe he'll be the candidate for Florida State in a year or two based on what goes on up there in Tallahassee.
Yeah, and that's the weird thing about Willie Taggart. If he didn't take the Oregon job and he was at South Florida this year and they were doing the same things they were this year where they only have one loss, he would probably also be another guy that would be getting more consideration if he would have just stayed at USF. And I'm not saying he should have stayed at USF, but I'm saying if he had, and they're undefeated or have one loss, then I think his name would be even higher on the board for a candidacy for the Florida job.
Yeah, well, timing matters, right? I mean, timing matters. It mattered back in 2015 when Jeremy Foley went out to get McElwain. I'm talking about high-level candidates who might be willing to come. There weren't any high-level candidates who were willing to come to Florida at that time, at least not that I can remember. And certainly, whether Florida was willing to spend the money to bring in one of those high-level candidates, I don't necessarily know. But, timing matters. And so, the fan base was never smitten with McElwain until that Ole Miss game, and then it was all downhill from there. He didn't have the political capital to be able to have a kind of season like this year, and to be able to act in the way that he did when it came to the death threats and that sort of, and calling out his players and all those sorts of things, to get the benefit of the doubt this year, and that's sort of what happened. So I think part of the reason to make this decision is there are viable candidates out there, both from a lower tier head coaches. There's probably some assistant coaches that are being looked at, depending upon what Strickland wants to do. And then certainly you've got these big fish out there as well. So, Strickland is not going to be able to say he was picking from a diluted pool this time. Yep. This is his hire, and he's going to have to hit it, because that's how you get graded as the athletic director at Florida, is how the football team's doing.
The only thing that might be diluted are the number of openings in the SEC. So.
Well, they're all competing against each other, right?
Right.
And so what it's going to do is it's going to raise prices.
Yep.
And if it's going to raise prices and you're going to have to spend it anyway, my contention is you spend it on the big fish rather than going for a coordinator or something like that.
Absolutely. Will, so you said your next article for SEC Country be coming out soon for South Carolina preview, right?
Yeah, it's more of a look into Nussmeier and sort of some of the things he's done from a running perspective. There's a little bit of South Carolina talk in there, but it's one of those things where I think holistically looking at why Florida's offense has struggled, and more in that vein rather than necessarily previewing the game. But there's a prediction in there and a little bit of talk about South Carolina. Gotcha.
Remember, you can find Will Miles on Twitter at Will Miles SCC. Thanks for Will Gunter for joining us talking South Carolina earlier. I'm your host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And guys and girls out there, thank you for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.